Hello and welcome back to MR Realities. This is Dave McCaughan coming to you from Bangkok, where I live, sometimes work as I travel around Asia doing all sorts of bits of projects. And with my good friend Kevin Gray, we put together this podcast to try and help people understand what's really happening with market research around the world today. Kevin, maybe you want to introduce yourself and tell us about our guest.
Okay, well, I'm Kevin Gray. I am an independent marketing science and analytics consultant. I guess nowadays we're called data scientists, which seems to mean everything and nothing at the same time. And I've spent most of my career in or around marketing research, and that's how I stumbled across you, Dave, and also JD Deitch, our guest today. JD and I have had numerous mail and message exchanges over the years, but we only spoke for the first time about 10 minutes ago, as he pointed out. So anyway, JD, thank you so much for your time. You're in Paris. We're all in three different countries. I'm in Tokyo, Bangkok, and Paris. So this is an international event, truly. A lot of people in the marketing research community know your name and probably have met you and seen you speak and so forth. But just in case there's someone out there who doesn't know anything about you or is confusing you with someone else for some reason, could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us, what you do, your background and so forth, very briefly?
Sure thing. So first, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. Glad to be speaking with both of you. JD, Jonathan Deitch, people ask me that question. I have been in market research now for over 20 years. By training, I am a social scientist and econometrician, which is one of the attractions to you, Kevin, as I watch you throw around words like serial correlation and heteroscedasticity. I got that training and realized that I wasn't very interested in academia and found my way to an allied field where I could use that skill set and study how people make decisions, and that was market research. I worked client side for a while, and then really for the past, it's about 14 years now, I've worked as on the supplier side. I spent about 8 years with the NPD group, who initially brought me to France. And I was leading their European research science efforts. I was at Ipsos for a number of years, where I was managing panel and sample in North America and then globally. And now I'm with a programmatic sample company called P2 Sample, where I have broad responsibilities over both the front of the house and the back of the house, if you will, marketing and sales and supply and operations. Actually, I have not had this much fun at work in a very long time. I'm really enjoying what I do these days. And in particular, I find it very interesting to be doing it at a time of such change, both in our industry and in society more broadly as well.
Well, I guess you like Paris.
I do. I love Paris. It was one of those things where actually we were moving our paper diaries online at NPD, and my boss, who's now the Chief Innovation Officer at NPD, Steve Coffey, he was the Chief Research Officer at the time. I used to pester him because he would say, "Oh, I have to go to Paris again," and I would say, "Oh, well, you could take me." And he actually brought me along. I just started working with the teams there, and there were a number of things going on. And just one day he turned around and said to me, "Hey, look, how would you feel about being on the ground over there, full time, at least temporarily?" So I came over as an expat, and just loved it. That assignment was over, and I ultimately had to go back to the States, but considering all of that and knowing how much of a great time that we had here, we decided to come back. And so here we are. It's technologies like what's driving this podcast right now that have enabled me to really work. I've worked internationally for 10 years now. And gosh, it's so great to have the technology and the inexpensive flights on occasion to be able to facilitate that and to have kind of the right work-life balance.
Yeah,
as
I
well.
certainly remember long, expensive international phone calls, and the reception, the transmission was not
Mm.
very good. And I mean, a fax machine was advanced. There was no initially at that time. Email was not very widely diffused until at least, well, I guess really the late '90s and early
Yeah.
part of the century globally.
So careful now. We're going to start to date ourselves,
All
Kevin.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So if you guys
But
want to date, if you guys want to
Move
date
us, move
yourselves,
us along, Dave. Move us
so
along.
yeah,
in all seriousness, JD, I got into market research and through the advertising industry quite late. But when I first got a job in market research, not only was I in charge of the key to the fax room, I was in charge of the key to the telex room, and the
oh,
first and
Yeah.
the first actual piece of market research I did was a telex-based survey where we sent telexes out to 100 people and got them to respond within 24 hours to a telex and a list of questions. That was a long time ago.
that's
I think
innovation.
you're in there.
Well,
I'm happy to
on the
concede to you
survey.
on that one.
We're on the topic of surveys, consumer surveys in particular, but in general. And that's one of your many areas of expertise, JD, and why we invited you. And I think probably a lot of our listeners do as well too, that consumer surveys are dying. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Um, I have many thoughts about that, of course. Gosh, where do you start with all of that, right?
Yeah.
I think, I think if we sort of start with the most superficial layer of that, what we see, especially recently, there's been a lot of concern about the accuracy of polls, especially. There have been some high-profile misses, and that's created some public doubt about that, that I think has indeed started to filter into our industry. But I also think too that there's some frustration with how surveys have been executed, some concerns, about what's going on under the hood, under the bonnet, whatever word you want to use for that metaphor, that are causing people to kind of question and say, well, what's really going on here when we're doing consumer surveys? And there are questions about respondents being engaged. There are questions about people actually being able to conjure up the memories that are required and recall how they feel, or even articulate a point of view that they may not even really have a strong point of view on. And then there are some really fascinating new developments in terms of methodologies, particularly all of the system one stuff, right? The non-conscious measurement that have really sort of taken the industry by storm. And there are a lot of people doing really good work on that. So I think there's a combination of things, and it creates, I think it creates some concern, but above all too, I think especially for buyers, it's a really difficult time to kind of to be a buyer of research these days, when you see the tried and true and you've got questions about that, and you see new things happening, you've got questions about those. But there are not too many resources out there to really kind of get up to speed and do that while you're trying to be successful in your job or anything like that. I mean,
So
there
a
are plenty of
lot of users then, and this would include probably some people at marketing research agencies, are really kind of out there on their own, and they don't have anyone really to guide them. I know I myself, I'm getting sales pitches of various kinds through emails, whatever. Constantly, and I look at this, and they tend to, look at them, and they're pretty vague. They seem to be promising something that's really cool, but I don't know enough to know whether or not what they're doing is legit or not. Do you have any general tips for users or potential users or buyers of survey research in terms of things that they should look for to make sure they're getting what they expect?
Yeah, although there's no real shortcuts to do it. If I'm perfectly honest, there's what you have to look for is going beyond the marketing and really, being able to sit down with somebody. And that of course obliges the supplier to be transparent about what they're doing too. The one of the things that we've tried to do, particularly over the past year, is to try to at least help people understand what are the criteria that you can use to judge different suppliers or different techniques. And to be honest, there's a lot of things that haven't changed, right? If you're looking at any of whether it's surveys or any of the other methodologies, newer methodologies especially, you're looking for proof points and you're asking yourself questions like, is this really fit for purpose? Can I ask somebody to remember all of the potato chips that they have eaten over the past 90 days? Maybe not, right? But they might remember the washing machine that they bought over the past 2 years. I mean, it's things like that. So there's a need to be thoughtful about that. But at the same time, there is actually, living in a world these days where, if you're doing good marketing, you have to be generating high quality content. There's actually a lot of really good content that's out there, from traditional suppliers to sort of new suppliers as well. And one of the easiest ways to get up to speed is to simply read. And yes, you may be getting points of view that kind of favor the supplier's perspective, but over time, it's pretty easy to judge whether you're being sold to or somebody's actually trying to have an educational conversation. And that reading and that content that's out there, I mean, there are blogs, there's some great industry websites. There's Research Live, there's Green Book, SMR's RW Connect, Quarks has good articles. I mean, there's a lot of places where you can find this content. And that's the way it starts. And if you've got the budget too, especially, attending 1 or 2 conferences a year is a good thing. I mean, the presentations can be, they can be of varying quality if we're honest. But at the same time, if you've never been to some of these shows and you have the opportunity to go, what's really valuable is walking around the room, meeting people, even talking to suppliers, even though you're going to end up on somebody's email list. Just kind of learning what people do is, that's how I started to learn about a lot of the new techniques as well, right? I mean, I'm not a specialist in non-conscious measurement, but I've attended a number of different webinars and have done a lot of reading on the subject, done a lot of talking to some very smart people in the industry. And that's how it happens. You have to build up that store of knowledge for yourself.
Yeah, it's a long road. Are there any seminars or books, webinars that you would recommend to people who are very new to marketing research or survey research generally?
So I've had a couple of people even in our company ask me for these types of recommendations. The blogs that I mentioned are good. They're interesting people to follow in the industry, right? Guys like Ray Pointer, guys like yourself, Lenny Murphy from Green Book, Kristen Lux says some really smart things, particularly about sort of the mix of research and how it operates as a business. These are all places where you can find out new things that are happening, because they'll mention these types of these different techniques, and they'll talk about the different conferences, and so they're good hubs in a way, from which you can then kind of go out and discover new things. Talking about survey research, Kevin, your lists that you've put out on LinkedIn about different aspects of methodology are outstanding. I mean, those are great resources for people to read on the subject. What's interesting, though, again, is for survey research in particular, most of the questions people have are not related to the methodology of survey research, but the challenges of conducting survey research in today's day and age. And there aren't too many people who are talking about that right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting area. So maybe we could just, get into that for a minute, because I this is what I hear when I attend conferences. I hear the same issues. I hear a lot in discussions about the difficulties. Now, obviously, because I tend to do, for some strange reason, the last few years, a lot more work in places like Bangladesh, Myanmar, places like that. The difficulties are sometimes might be primal to people that are based in, so-called developed countries. But there are difficulties everywhere, right? In terms of today of just getting like respondents levels, getting the right type of respondents, getting people to consistently want to do things. What do you think is happening with that? Or what's your opinion of what's happening with some of these issues about compliance, getting people to actually, getting the right respondents? How do you go about those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's the question that people are asking right now. And the word they typically use to describe it, and people talk about sample quality and
Yeah.
Are we speaking about the right people? And there's a lot of things that quality can mean, but if we kind of go down to the most basic level, it's, are we talking to real engaged people?
Right.
What's happened, I think we're all generally aware of how technology has evolved over the past 20 odd years. I mean, we sort of willingly dove in the pool of online sampling by virtue of its promise of reach and lower cost, and that promise has had upsides and downsides. But over the years, what happened in many respects is, we as an industry didn't evolve our offer to be as engaging as some of the other things that people were doing online. And
Right.
So, participation started to drop. And this is not anything new, guys. This is like 10 years ago. And then you have the advent of the mobile phone in this connected age, where all of a sudden, people are not sitting at their computers for 45 minutes looking at brochures on screens anymore like they were doing in 1998 when I first did my first online consumer survey. I mean, they're flipping through their phones and almost obsessively every 30 seconds, and we really haven't changed our methods so much since we were doing paper diaries. I mean, we're still trying to get people to sit down and concentrate for a long period of time. And that's had some bad consequences. And the worst of those consequences is that because there's a lot of money at stake, change has happened really slowly. People don't want to rock the boat with their clients. And at the same time, particularly in large companies, it's very difficult to kind of adapt to new technologies. And so you've seen really, as the industry is still talking about, let's all move to mobile friendly surveys. And we first had these conversations, 5 years ago?
20 years ago. 20 years ago.
Well,
Literally 20 years ago.
Okay. So those are the challenges. I mean, they come down to what are you actually doing to make sure that you're engaging real people, and the things that the industry has been doing right now are no longer working. Right, we're seeing a rise in fraud, and it's not sort of the pimply faced teenager who's making multiple registrations in a very sort of artisanal, persevering way. No, it's people using automation. It's human beings and machines, attacking, panel systems, sampling systems, and getting in. We talk about there's an increasing amount of fraud in the industry. We talk about engagement, right? But when you ask people what they're doing about engagement, most of them, for them it's a questionnaire design issue, when there are plenty of things that you can do if you're using the right technology to actually create better outcomes for respondents. And this is a place I've been writing rather passionately about this for a number of years, because we all need to stop thinking that what we're doing is working anymore. And it goes back to the initial question of surveys. Are surveys getting worse? Well, they are, but they don't have to be. Sample doesn't have to be a commodity. There are ways that you can use technology in particular to create better outcomes for the respondents, get them the surveys faster, validate that they're real. And sample companies need to be doing that. And it's their own fault as well. They've sort of been very quiet, and they haven't really had a good response to the criticisms that have been levied at them.
Yeah, the sense that I get is that a lot of, or at least some of these panel companies are trying then to move into the traditional marketing research space and become marketing research agencies. You think about it, it makes sense, because marketing research agencies originally years ago were essentially fieldwork companies. There wasn't very much
Right.
Beyond that they were able to do because of computational costs, and the industry was a lot smaller. But in doing that, and also with big data and blending surveys with client or say retail panel data, whatever, and that's fine. That's excellent. But perhaps in doing that, this is just my impression, but in doing that, it seems progressive, it seems good, but maybe they're just kind of dropping the ball on some of the most important things.
Yeah, it's a good observation, Kevin. There are a lot of, particularly the larger companies, are what they're basically doing is disintermediating the agencies that used to buy their sample, right? I mean, it's the industry has seen a slowdown in the growth of revenue, right? And this is the agency side, and thus their suppliers, if they're wholly dependent on those agencies, will have seen a slowdown in revenue as well. And so that the suppliers are disintermediating, but they're not necessarily solving the fundamental problem of are we really just polluting the waters more and more? Now, I should be clear that where we used to be in terms of technology and where we are now, we've made great steps. There's a lot of automation that's happening. There's a lot of things that are working better these days, but there's still a need to really be paying attention to that respondent. And let me sort of mention some ways that happens, right? I mean, we talk about fraud, for example, but all of the techniques that are out there, whether it's email validation, address validation, or questionnaire techniques like trap questions, or technological solutions like what they call honeypots or CAPTCHAs. These things are not stopping fraud. That's yesterday's fraud that they were solving. They're not stopping these sophisticated attacks that are happening these days. We've sort of looked at this and have said, the only way that we're going to be able to do anything about it is by trying to create a dynamic system that can figure out how these vectors of attacks are changing over time. And so we've implemented, what we've done is we've used machine learning and artificial intelligence and about 500 million data points to try to create an algorithm that spots fraud. And that's a solution that's sort of forward-looking as opposed to the rest of these things. I mean, you think about engagement as well. I mean, the sample companies sort of act like they're beholden to fielding any study and just bombing sample at it, and so, they're not necessarily using technology that allows them not to have to ask a respondent 18 times for their age and sex, or to recognize that there's some problem with the survey and stop throwing sample at it so that people don't just drop out. You can use automation for a lot of these things. And it actually creates a virtuous circle where you get a lot of profile data. You can better target people. If you're kind of keeping track in an automated way of how a survey is filling, then you can spot problems in real time and sort them out, right? I mean, we even take respondent ratings of surveys into account to try to judge that. And we make decisions in field about how much sample we're going to allocate to a study. And good studies, I don't care whether they're 15 minutes or 5 minutes, mobile friendly or not, if it's a good experience and you have all the data in front of you, low dropout rate, the good ratings from people, the surveys filling as you would expect it to see, then it's going to get more sample. But if it's got a high dropout rate or there's quota problems or something like that, we will actually start to reduce the sample. And ultimately, if there's a real problem, we'll shut it down because it's not going to finish anyway. And, a project manager gets an automated message. They're on the phone with the client immediately within 15 minutes saying, hey, look, there's a problem with your study. Here's what we're seeing. And by doing that, you actually solve the things that clients hate the most, which is getting out of field and realizing, oh, crap, I've got bad data or this didn't work out right. There's just so many things that people can be doing to solve those problems.
Well, that's it. There's the panel side of it, and we can get back to that. I think some of that is probably pretty technical, and some of it may be, I'm sure some of it definitely is proprietary, but maybe getting back to basics.
Sure.
Part of the issue with data quality certainly must stem from the questionnaire itself.
Mm-hmm.
Are there common mistakes that you see made in survey research, either in the design or even the screeners or anything? Any tips you can share with us?
Yeah. There's a lot of it has been said before, but the good practices don't change with the times, right? The first is the recognition that it's not just millennials anymore. The number of people who are using mobile devices, even into their 60s, is very high. The number of people who are able to complete studies online on mobile devices is very high. Being device agnostic and mobile first is absolutely a no-brainer and something you must do, because if you're not doing that, you're missing out on real behaviors. And you'll be getting bad data. I don't care what you're studying these days. That's one thing. When you're depending on the topic that you're asking people as well, there's really this question, and people don't do it enough. I remember a number of years ago, again at SMR, there's a guy by the name of David McCaughan who used to work with Harris, and now he's on his own. Who did a day-long questionnaire class. And I got this technique out of it that was his. He called it the Think Aloud Pretest, where you actually sit there, you take your own study, and you talk as you're taking it. And you say exactly what you're thinking. And it causes you to ask questions like, if somebody were asking me this, could I pull up this memory? Do I see a response that fits my ability to answer the question? In the days of, in today's, environment where speed is really a priority, we kind of miss this basic element of it. And then there's just, the simplicity of questions. People talk about grid questions all the time. We know there's so much research that says that people find them extremely confusing, but they're very compact, right? So, and yet we still do it. So there's a lot of these things that we already know. And I think, that points to one of the other problems too. Well, if we know them, why aren't we doing them? And some of the issue is that we've got tracking studies that have been around for 5 or 10 years, and people are loath to lose their trends. But then there's also the changing the changing market research departments, client side. I mean, those departments have changed, and there's work being done all over companies now. It's not exclusively being done by the market research team. Those days are long gone, and that monopoly over the research budget and the methodology is long gone as well.
Yeah, and I know I find, well, two things from what you said. Second, but first is what you just said about the the structure of companies and the way they do things. I know Kevin talks often on his different blog posts and stuff about the fact that there's just not enough people with the right training. And so if you are dispersing the responsibility for doing the research to a much broader group of people, you find that naturally a lot of those people have a lot less education on how to do it properly. Even the simple things, which is that point you just made, which is the read aloud test. You know, tellingly for me, when somebody I'm sitting next to somewhere turns around and says, "Hey, Dave, you sort of work in market research. What does this question mean?" Well, you know that somebody hasn't really read the question in the first place that was setting it, right? So, and I think that's one of the biggest simple things I find. And the two things come together. As I work with an awful lot of companies which have dispersed the responsibility for getting questionnaires done, or sometimes just the creation of questionnaires and the creation of surveys to all sorts of people in the organization, they haven't been instructed in just that simple thing of, have you actually read this? Like, if somebody gave you this survey, could you answer it?
Right.
You know, it sounds to the three of us, and hopefully to most of the people that listen to our podcast, it seems so obvious. But it's the sort of simple things, the simple rules that sort of don't get taught enough.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, well, that's getting to the issue of DIY, which is kind of like one of those things that marketing researchers, at least on the agency side, love to gripe about. DIY is sort of like Godzilla coming in and destroying our industry. On the other hand, there are people who see it very differently. And DIY, the general concept is not new. When I started out on the client side, and a lot of our stuff was DIY. We didn't actually telephone interviews and so forth were administered by someone else, but we did virtually everything ourselves, and mail, postal surveys we were able to do ourselves, even some of the data processing. So the concept is not new, but technology has changed very much, and particularly in the last 10 years or so, and there's a lot more of that around. Now, what are your thoughts on DIY then, to kind of extend what Dave was just saying, we were saying before that? How is that affecting the industry, marketing research?
Yeah, I remember a Casro conference where two of the guys from the top, I think it was SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, were on the stage with a couple of traditional research methodologists, and you could tell everybody was pretty grumpy about the whole exchange. This is probably 2013. I think fundamentally that unless you're really sort of a trained market researcher and you're really thoughtful about this, most people don't want to do DIY, if I'm perfectly honest. I have no issues with the practice at all. I think it's DIY tools have given an underserved and perhaps an unserved part of the marketplace the opportunity to gather data and to try to be more informed than they already are. And I think that on balance, that's a good thing. Yes, are there risks there? Naturally, there are risks, right? But there are risks in doing studies with large companies as well. Theoretically, they're moderated, but I mean, in these days, in a lot of large companies, the client service person you're working with is an account manager that has no research training whatsoever. But coming back to the principle of DIY, the execution of DIY, I actually don't think most people want to do it. Now, I've worked with a DIY company I worked with a company for about a year on this. And what people really want when they talk about DIY is a faster and cheaper research experience. That was mostly what our end clients were saying. And they're not wrong for wanting that, because if you look at where we came from, in most surveys, you would need to pay an agency $5,000 to just to get out of bed and work on your project. And it might take 4 to 6 weeks to get that done. And that's just not an acceptable, that's not an acceptable state of affairs in today's marketplace. So I think DIY arose in a response to that, this idea that it was it could solve that problem. But then you start to see interesting implementations of it. I mean, you know, I know some of the guys at Zappy Store and what they're doing by automating research. You know, somebody else's intellectual property. Maybe that's one of their clients that they're privately working for. You know, maybe it's one of the big agencies. You know, one of their products. But you know, there's a great balance of trying to do good research, but to do it faster and more cost effectively. So, I mean, I think those are all good things.
I just have, we're starting to run a little bit short on time here, and I just have one last question for you, JD, before I turn things back to Dave. But and this, my question, you know, leads from you know, what you were just saying. And that is, say, okay, things have changed a lot recently, and they're continuing to change. You've talked about fraud and automation, and now DIY and so forth. Where do you see consumer surveys or survey research, generally speaking, heading? What do you think it would, if you want to venture a guess, will be like in 5 years or 10 years time?
That's a really good question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm not sure I have a great answer. Here's how I feel about it right now. I think it will be extremely automated. I think the execution of it has to be. It's all heading that way anyway. I still think there'll be plenty of room for people wanting to do surveys. I think that's even still a default for most people, and asking people what they think or what they do or how they feel is still a great way to figure out those things. It's still a great way. It's the right way to answer those questions. But I think the execution of it's going to be very different. I think it will be less of a standalone discipline, if you will. I mean, you know, there are large companies, large divisions of companies that kind of do exclusively survey research. And I think this will be one of the many arrows in the quiver of new agencies who, you know, by virtue of technology that has also captured the intellect that's needed in that process, because there's plenty of ways that technology is going to evolve. So we don't have to worry about the quality aspects that we've been talking about today. I think that's how it's going to evolve. And I think the people doing it are not going to necessarily be exclusively market researchers, but they're going to end up being more broadly strategists or tacticians that can help clients answer their business question and deploy data and technology in the service of that, so that they're making informed decisions.
Yeah, that's interesting. We could go on, I'm sure, for 5 years about this. I've been talking too much. Dave?
So as a supplement to that, JD, again, because I live in a part of the world where we see some unusual things happening, I'm starting to see, based here in Thailand, but also in some other Asian countries, more and more people are attempting to do surveys without using any written questions as we would know them. They're just using emoji, stamps, graphics. And the answers are to be delivered only in emoji, stamps, and graphics. And I'm just wondering if you've come across that in the work you're doing, and what do you think of that, where people are using an alternative language, in effect, to do their surveys?
I actually am aware a little bit of that. I had heard a presentation at an IEX conference a couple of years ago by a company that was using images as a way of getting people to express their feelings. I personally, I've not done that sort of research myself, but the idea absolutely makes sense, right? I mean, you know, right. If you give people a very fast way to express their emotions about something, then you're sort of creating a better experience for them. And as long as those emotions are clear and distinguishable, then it will allow them to to pick something that corresponds with their feelings. I mean, you know, you go back to the basics again. You know, can the person answer the thing, and does the data collection method make sense? And you know, it's a great way to do that, and it sounds like it would be quite speedy and transferable across countries as well. So it sounds
well.
Really,
I guess the answer to that one is, now that we're starting to see over the last 12, 18 months the development of emoji translators as a profession, both as in terms of human beings, and then also automated translators. One of the questions that's happening, of course, is, do emojis translate the same in every culture? And of course, that's not always the case. So I know the difference between the use of line in Thailand and Japan, that there are some emojis that are used differently in the two different marketplaces to represent different things. So when you use them to ask a question, you know, but it's an interesting development as we see a new type of language developing.
But that's the role that the researcher needs to play, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
It's the researcher that needs to know those things, and that's the beauty of the way that technology is evolving right now. Technology can evolve to make sure that our execution is at such higher level of quality and dependability that we have the opportunity to be more thoughtful. But that, you know, that changes the responsibility for the researcher as well, which is not necessarily having to know all about the research methodology, but having to know really the concrete things about the behavior or the decisions that are being made that make them valuable partners to their clients.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And as we see the way in which people are reacting and using technologies in different ways, I think that's true. I think what will happen is that the human side is understanding the cultural ways in which people are responding and why it is that they're likely to respond to stuff, and et cetera. And then using automation to just make us much more efficient at getting it done. That's been great. Listen, I always finish all of these podcasts to all of our guests with the same basic question. So I'm going to throw it at you, which is maybe more relevant to you than some. But the question is, of all the research that you've been involved in and all the surveys that you might have overseen, what's the one question you didn't ask that you wish you had?
I think I might disappoint the group here. I can't think of anything right now, to be perfectly honest with you.
You might be the wrong person.
You know, guys, I love the field. I really do. I've enjoyed the 20 years, and I'm very satisfied with how things have gone. But you know, it's funny. Even as an analyst, I was always kind of looking upward and looking at sort of broader implications rather than looking into the methodology and the surveys. And so, you know,
well, listen, have a think about it. I'll send you one of the. It's a strange thing, as Kevin knows, that sort of a sidelight for me out of doing all these podcasts with him is that I've managed to turn that question and the answers I get that question into presentations and stuff that I now do at conferences around that theme. And so I keep on asking it because the variety of answers is probably a good indication to the fact that people that work in our industry have a huge variety of different experiences, and it's good to get a broad sort of feel. But having said that, thanks very much for your time, JD. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to leave the podcast by just asking a request. While we were talking, I was just checking something, and you and I have a pending friendship thing on LinkedIn going on. So I don't know which of us owes it, but we should try and connect through there. And it's been great. Hope to stay in touch. Thanks for your time.
Okay.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to both of you. Bye.
Bye.